Senator Ludlam.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise to speak on the issue of what's occurring up in the West Kimberley at the moment, my home state of WA, where there are scenes being played out that are reminiscent of Noonkanbah for people with long enough memories. When in the West Kimberley we had Aboriginal people and their supporters blocking access to country by bulldozers that were in this case protected by the police and even army units sent up by Premier Charles Court to allow an American drilling company access to a sacred site, which they duly violated. With a touch of irony, there was no oil there and the entire exercise was a complete waste of time. But those scenes were absolutely formative in the West Kimberley. They're the reason that we have an Aboriginal Heritage Act, such as it is in WA. And these scenes are being played out all over again now as Woodside moves heavy equipment on site to begin land clearing for the Browse Basin Gas Plant project, a gigantic industrial complex which is proposed at 40 or 50 kilometres north of Broome at the moment. And it's amazing to be hearing these reports and seeing what's happening up there, that we now have a blockade camp across Minari Road where they've had up to 120 people blocking the road, trying to stop successfully Woodside and its contractors getting equipment onto country. My dear colleague Robin Chappell, MLC, spent quite a bit of time up there. Performers John Butler and Dan Sultan have been there. I was very fortunate to visit with my team a month or so ago. And it's extraordinary to see, because this project hasn't been approved yet, either by the state government or the federal government. Normally, in my experience, the non-violent direct action and the people putting themselves on the line, putting themselves in the way to stop these sort of projects, that generally comes last after all options have been exhausted. And in this case, it's happening before either the state or federal governments have given formal approval, because the companies decided to move in and start land clearing anyhow. So they're proposing to put in roads, to flatten areas, to do work that is allegedly in order to complete their environmental impact assessment processes before approvals have been given. As was the case at Noonkanbah, local opposition is the backbone. These actions are being led by local Aboriginal people and supported by West Kimberley residents. And blow-ins like myself, who manage to turn up when we can, are very much in the minority, because this one is being run by residents of the West Kimberley who oppose the influx of industrialisation of precisely the wrong kind of the West Kimberley. The blockade is taking place along non-violent principles, and ironically enough, one of the reports that I've read shows that the only people who are being led on site at the moment are the contractors' security guards to protect their earth-moving equipment, which is up there, and apart from that, nothing is moving at all. People are conducting themselves with great respect for the Aboriginal people who are leading this movement up there, and very little work, if any, is occurring from time to time. And the question, of course, is why on earth are they having to take these kind of matters into their own hands, as happens from time to time. And in this case, in the instance of the West Kimberley, it's absolutely crucial that we pay attention to why people feel so strongly about the way that Woodside is conducting itself, that the joint venture partners are conducting themselves, and what the state government has unleashed, and the federal government standing passively by, allowing to happen. It's worth paying attention to a little bit of history to realise how things got so bad and why we now have this collision of interests and this clash on the Cape in the West Kimberley. The former government, Carpenter Western Australian government, had a process in place which wasn't perfect at all, but it did have, at its heart, the principle of free, prior and informed consent. There were more than a dozen sites on the table, and the Kimberley Land Council had been tasked with liaising with Aboriginal communities up and down the Cape and the length and breadth of the top end of the West and East Kimberley, liaising with Aboriginal communities saying, if you don't want your site to be in question, if you don't want to be at the table for these negotiations, then take it out. At that point, at the time of the change of government, when the Barnett government was elected, there were 4 left. There were 4 sites remaining, and everybody in those negotiations knew that they could take their country off the table if they sought to. The Barnett government, of course, rejected that approach in its entirety and went for compulsory acquisition. Within a couple of weeks of the election, they were talking about returning us to the colonial past of Western Australia, whereby you give it to us or else we'll take it. Doing this under cover of native title laws that can say you have the right to negotiate but you don't have the right to say no. It's no more than a colonial land grab. It's absolutely disgusting what the Barnett government is doing in that instance. They would have had a site by now if they'd pursued a path of free, prior and informed consent. And instead of having the site, they have a conflict. And Woodside has played entirely into this dispute in the same way. It is entirely preemptive, the way that the state government behaved with saying, give us the land, shake hands, sign a cheque, or else we'll just come and take it without you, because that's what compulsory acquisition means. Hand it over, or we'll have it with your consent or without it. And now, of course, the company, in the absence of state or federal approvals, is moving in and has put earth-moving equipment on site. No wonder people are furious up in the West Kimberley. No wonder that they're calling for help, and they're getting help from all over the country. The Premier last year, Colin Barnett, called it an unremarkable bit of coast. Well, having visited that area a couple of times, I can say quite clearly for the record that it is a remarkable bit of coast, and it's a shame that our unremarkable Premier doesn't pay a little bit closer attention and maybe spend a bit more time up there himself on the country that he is proposing to wreck, to allow Woodside to wreck. The values of the West Kimberley, I think, are pretty well identified. We had confirmation again, if any was necessary, by a study led by CSIRO, which was produced only recently, only a week or so. And in that study, they say up to 45 native species in Western Australia's Kimberley region will die out within 20 years if no action is taken. They've called for an immediate cash injection of $95 million to save creatures, including the golden bandicoot, the scaly-tailed possum and the Mongian rock wallaby from extinction. The potential of a mass extinction unfolding across the north of Australia has been on the cards for some time. Because in the south we pursued the industrial development path of rip it, ship it, blast it, cut it down, whatever it takes, in the south of Australia, and the reason that we're in such trouble in places like the Murray-Darling, the reason we're still fighting in the forests of Tasmania, in Gippsland and in New South Wales, is because of this mentality that the only kind of economy is an extractive one, that it only counts as economic growth if we're blowing it up and shipping it out overseas. We cannot allow this mentality to take hold in the Kimberley, or indeed across the north of Australia, because anybody working in the Kimberley, across the top end or in the Cape knows that we do have a chance to do things differently. We do have a chance to pursue non-extractive forms of economic development in which not just the community is sustained indefinitely, but also the economic and the ecological values that sustain those communities are themselves sustained. That is the opportunity that we have in the Kimberley now, but not if the Premier gets his way and not if Woodside get their way. Because we know, and the people in the Kimberley know very well, that if that gas plant is placed at that bit of coast in the West Kimberley, that unlocks a wave of economic development, or of extractive development, if you can call it that, across the Kimberley. Uranium mining in the Fitzroy Valley, 300 kilometres of coal tenements in the Fitzroy Valley, bauxite mining in the Mitchell Plateau area, and more downstream processing of gas for export. The residents of the Kimberley don't necessarily want the same mistakes that have plagued the Pilbara and the south of our country to be repeated again, and that's why they're standing up. What needs to happen, I think, surely would be obvious to anybody with a basic appreciation of what's gone on in Australia and how we could do things differently in the Kimberley. We need to listen to local voices for local governance and for local economic development in a form that is appropriate to the Kimberley, and not to simply repeat the mistakes of the past at the behest of oil and gas companies and mining companies. And that, I think, will end up locking in on non-extractive economics, non-extractive economic development that is not based on chewing down the resource base on which we depend. And what the gas plant proponents need to do is do what they said they would do and look for alternatives. The bulldozers need to come off country while the companies do what they are obliged to do, and this is where the Commonwealth can play such an important role. They were supposed to ensure, as a part of the strategic environmental impact assessment that was undertaken, that all alternatives, all sensible and feasible alternatives had been examined before Woodside went on to that country with earth-moving equipment to start trashing the place. And we know that that hasn't been done. Has Woodside examined their options for processing the gas offshore, as Shell are contemplating doing? Have they looked at their options for processing that gas further down the coast at existing gas plants in the Pilbara? None of that work has been done. Premier Colin Barnett said that's where it's going. Woodside said that's where it's going. And interestingly enough, we know that the joint venture partners are not as keen as Woodside is for their own homegrown gas plant in the West Kimberley, that there is substantial tension inside the joint venture as to where that should go. Well, that tension now has been met by people blockading the site in question, people who are standing up and saying, this must not happen. There is dispute up there. There is absolutely dispute, and this will always be the case, where the state government decides to ram raid and puts groups like the Kimberley Land Council in the impossible position of saying, sign up to this or we'll have it anyway. It's absolutely unbelievable that in 2011 this is still the process that we call economic development. It's outrageous. For the people who are putting themselves on the line up there, I know that some of the work is probably not what you'd expect, and I encourage MPs, not just from Western Australia, because this is a national issue, to get up there and sit down with the people who are on site and find out what it is that they're doing. Some of it's a bit unusual. Some of it is flora and fauna surveys to do the work that Woodside's contractors aren't doing. Some of it is information for the tourists who come past or for people in Broome or Derby to find out exactly what this form of economic vandalism would do to the West Kimberley and to the broader economy. So to the folks up there who have maybe some of them put their lives on hold to do this work, it may seem an awfully long way from Canberra, but we can hear you. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep behaving with the dignity and the commitment that you've shown so far, because it is getting through. It's going to be a long fight and a very tough one. But it can't be done without those voices on the ground locally in the West Kimberley. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Ludlam.